So, what we're going to look at today, I just put this in the chat, I hope you can see it, is the investment that the Apostle Paul made in the ecclesia, the called out ones in Ephesus. You know, ecclesia is often translated as church, but we know that Kirche in German is how we got the word church to mean the building. But in the New Testament, the church has nothing to do with the building. But often we use the terms interchangeably. I'll meet you at the church, or we're having church in our home today. And we have really two very different meanings for the word. But the ecclesia, the ones that are called out in Ephesus, Paul made an enormous investment in these people, which is my first of 2 points. So, for a brief time, at the end of his second missionary journey, he was in Ephesus, and then he spent more than 2 years in Ephesus teaching um, his third missionary journey. And so he had a major life and time investment in the church in Ephesus. Now, if you compare that with other churches, like how long did he spend in Philippi? About 3 months. How long was he in Thessalonica? About 3 weeks. So the amount of time that Paul invested in his church planning, a lot went into Ephesus. Then he wrote. So not only he spent all these years there, but then he wrote the book of Ephesians around 60 to 61 AD. Now, later in Paul's life, he was preaching in Macedonia. When he was there, he heard that what Timothy was doing in Ephesus, and that's what prompted him to write First Timothy. So First Timothy and Ephesians are very much connected, which he wrote somewhere around 63 AD. So if you have your Bible, and I hope you do, First Timothy chapter 1, all of our references this morning will be in Timothy because of its connection to Ephesus. So in First Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, he says, I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. And we're going to talk about that. But that's why he left Timothy in Ephesus, was to ensure that people would teach no other doctrine but sound doctrine. And then if you turn over to chapter 3, this is First Timothy chapter 3, and in verse 14 to 15, we see the purpose of First Timothy. And I'm so glad that Paul didn't use the excuse, hey, I'll be there in a few days, I'll be there in a few weeks, we'll talk about it then. Because in verse 14, he says, these things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. So I hope to be there, but if I get delayed, verse 15, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God. And so I'm so glad that Paul did write, because now we have First Timothy. And if Paul had taken the approach, well, no worries, I'll just be there in a few weeks. You know, in Paul's life, there's a lot of uncertainty about where he'd be because of the Jews that were constantly chasing him from town to town to town. And I think of the urgency of doing what needs to be done now for the sake of the gospel and not waiting. We have a couple other great examples of that. Remember Samuel, when Samuel was called to anoint the king, he goes to the house of Jesse and 7 sons pass before him. And he goes, this is not the one. Is there anyone else? He said, well, yeah, there's the shepherd boy. And he says, call him. We will not sit down until he comes. Now, it wasn't like you opened the back door and say, hey, David, come in. He was way, way, way. So, I don't know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes by the time someone runs and gets him and brings him back. And Samuel says, we're not going to sit down. Now, the culture, of course, is, hey, have a seat, make yourself comfortable. Here's some tea. If in India, it'd be chai, of course. But Samuel says, we will not sit. There's this urgency. We're here on God's business. We're not screwing around. Jesus said, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. The disciples are all focused on food, as we so often are. And Jesus says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me, in John chapter 4. So there's this urgency, and because of that, Paul writes First Timothy, and we've been benefiting for 2,000 years because he did that. So there's at least 3 central themes in First Timothy, and there's more than 3, but we don't have time for that. But we do have time for a few, and one is that Paul wasn't keen that the teaching and the doctrine would be sound. Now, Amy Fife said a couple of weeks ago, there's nothing more important than our view of God. That's absolutely true, because what you believe about God is going to determine everything about what you do. Not just about where you're going to spend eternity, but it's going to determine how you're going to live. And having an accurate view of the Lord will lead to godly edification. Look at chapter 1, verse 5. The purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith. So solid teaching leads to godly edification, which is at the end of verse 4, and then all the things that are listed in verse 5. And this idea of false or misplaced teaching, what does that lead to? At the beginning of verse 4, the fables and endless genealogies cause disputes. So we can tell if our teaching is right or not because of the fruit. Are we creating disputes and people arguing about things? Or is there love from a pure heart and sincere conscience? And this idea of a pure conscience is repeated in verse 5. We see it in verse 19, and I want to look at that. Look at verse 19. This is chapter 1 of 1 Timothy. Having faith and a good conscience. This is Timothy being charged to live that way. But then he says, which some having rejected good conscience concerning the faith have suffered shipwreck. A wrecked ship is one that doesn't work, of whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander. And we'll talk about those guys later. And then if you reach over to chapter 5, verse 22, he says, keep yourself pure. So there's this focus in Timothy about purity of life, purity with our conscience, and purity, of course, in the message. So then he gives examples and warnings of those that have gone astray. So I just thinking, the song that was selected for our worship this morning, we're talking about how holy God is, and the angels cry out. And First Timothy is very much about how do we live in the world where that's the reality that we're going to be in. But on this earth, we have to face all these problems. And these are all problems in the church. First Timothy was not written to unbelievers. So these are problems in the church, like this Hymenaeus and Alexander in chapter 1, verse 20. These guys used to be in the faith. It says that concerning the faith, they have suffered shipwreck. So they were in the faith, and now they're not in the faith. And how difficult that is for any congregation or any leader to deal with. So to the point, their faith was so shipwrecked, we see in verse 20 that he delivered them in his apostolic authority to Satan, that they would learn not to blaspheme. Paul is infinitely concerned with the glory of God and the church not besmirching the name of Christ. And so these guys were so bad, he had to deliver them over to Satan. Doesn't say how he did that. I'm sure there's a lot of speculation about that, but we don't have time for that this morning. We see this also in chapter 4, verse 2. But in chapter 5, we don't have time to go into all of it, but I do want to read one verse. Chapter 5 is, in my view, the most ignored chapter in the New Testament. It seems to me when I read chapter 5 of 1 Timothy that almost nobody is doing or talking about these things. But in chapter 5, from verse 3 to 16, he talks about widows versus real widows. And look at verse 15. For some have already turned aside after Satan. Those are pretty harsh words. That's not the kind of thing you'd like to talk about from the pulpit on a Sunday morning. But that's the word of God about some widows who had grown wanton against Christ and left their first love. Look at verse 11. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, and it goes on from there. So that's another example of someone who had gone astray. And then, unfortunately, the last example is those who, sorry, I'm having a hard time with my phone, those who desire to be rich, the rich wannabes. Look at chapter 6, 1 Timothy chapter 6, and look at verse 9. Now, it doesn't say that the people who are rich fall into temptation and a snare. It says those who desire to be rich. It's a heart issue. It's not how much is in your bank issue. Just like in verse 10, it says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Money itself is not evil. It's in our heart. If we love it, we're going to make all kinds of terrible mistakes. I'll never forget, I took a college level entrance placement exam, many, many years ago when I was in college. And the idea was if I passed this test, I wouldn't have to take a 5-hour English class. And I thought, yes, I would rather not do that. And I remember thinking, man, if I screw this up, I'm going to have to take that class. It's going to push off my graduation. I was concerned about it. And the last question of this 4-hour test, which had to do with grammar and all this, at the very end, you pick like 5 different statements and comment on them. And one of the statements was, the love of money is the root of all evil. I'm sorry. The statement was, money is the root of all evil. And I thought, oh man, I can address this all day long. So I went into this whole thing. This comes from the writings of St. Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And it's not money that's the root of all evil, it's the love of money. So in the same way, those who desire to be rich, and this is verse 9, those who desire to be rich, they have 6 terrible things happen to them. But compare that with the people that are described in verse 6. Godliness plus contentment is great gain. It's not a little gain, it's great gain. And it's not godliness alone or contentment alone. They have to be put together. Godliness is great gain. And we know that what that looks like from verse 8. If we have food and clothes, and the King James raiment, we have protection, shelter. But in verse 9, here's the 6 things that happen to the people that desire to be rich. And we're not talking about unbelievers. This is addressed to believers. He says, those who desire to be rich fall. First of all, I don't like that verb at all. They're not lifted up. They're not encouraged, but they fall. And they fall into temptation. Now, Jesus told us to pray that you would not enter into temptation. So we don't want, temptation is not desirable. We're going to have plenty of it without asking for it. And so the first fall is temptation, and then a snare. What is a snare? It's a trap. You use it to trap animals, trap a bird. And normally when that animal is trapped in it, the harder it tries to get out, the more damage it does to itself. So these are stark pictures of something that's entirely preventable. They fall into temptation and a snare, into many foolish and harmful lusts. Not a few foolish and harmful lusts, many. And then look at this. Those lusts drown men into destruction, which is self-evident. We know what destruction is, but perdition. I actually looked up perdition in a secular dictionary, and I'm going to share it with you, because perdition is even worse than destruction. In Christian theology, perdition is a state of eternal punishment and damnation into which a sinful and unpenitent person passes after death. So we know from James that, desire gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives forth death. That's what he's describing here. It starts with temptation, ends with perdition, all preventable, because we as Christ followers are called to not have love for money. We can't serve God and mammon. So, and then last but not least, look at chapter 6, verse 21. Again, this concept of straying. He says, by professing it, some have strayed concerning the faith. And the it is referring to verse 20, profane and idle babblings. So it's so important that we teach sound doctrine. We'll know we're teaching sound doctrine when there's godliness, when there's a pure conscience, when people are listening to their conscience instead of rejecting it. And then we won't stray from the faith. And could it be that Paul is arguably investing much more time, energy, and epistle writing into Ephesus because of the quirks and nuances of witnessing Christ in a complex and very urbane, sophisticated culture? Remember, Ephesus was, depending on this which historian, ranked as the number 2 most important city in the empire, behind Rome, or maybe number 4. I've seen it as between 2 and 4, but this is one of the most important cities in the world at the time. No wonder Paul spent so much time there, wrote an epistle, left Timothy there. And now how does that have to do with us? As to borrow a term from Pat Gelsinger, the CEO at Intel, the Bay Area, we are WIMPs, W-I-M-P. WIMPs is an acronym. W stands for wealthy. This is the wealthiest area in the world, is the San Francisco Bay Area. I stands for influential. The things that happen here determine what happens all over the world with technology, databases, cell phones, computers, AI. NVIDIA was the center of attention yesterday because of the earnings announcement. M stands for miserly. As a percentage of income and as a percentage of assets, the people in the Bay Area are amongst the most miserly in the country. You know, by the way, that the more people make in the church, the more people make, the lower percentage they give. The richest, the most generous people in the world are the poorest as a percentage of their income. This is true around the world. And last but not least, P, we are pagans. Before the pandemic, 5-6% of the valley went to church in the morning. Of half of those would have been Roman Catholic. Today, I don't even know if it's that. That means that what's near and dear to our hearts while we're fasting and praying this week is irrelevant to 98% of the people that we live with. And so we have a pagan culture, much like Ephesus. We have a wealthy culture, much like Ephesus. And so the words that Paul wrote to Timothy as a leader, guiding the church in Ephesus, are relevant for us today. And I pray somehow God will use this for the glory of his kingdom. Thank you.